All right, let's just jump right in. When you think about how the world works, who do you picture in charge? Probably presidents, prime ministers, right? We see countries as these big, powerful actors, making moves based on their national interest. But what if that's only half the story?
You see, for the longest time, the main way people tried to understand international relations was through a theory called realism. And it gives us this really simple, kind of intuitive picture of how countries get along or don't. Think of it like a game of pool. Every ball is a country. There are these hard, solid units that just bounce off each other. Their power is their size, their speed. What's going on inside the ball, its internal politics, its companies, that stuff doesn't matter for the game. It's all about how they collide on the world stage. Super simple, right? Clean. And for ages, this was the standard view. But what if, when you get right up close, those billiard balls aren't so solid after all? What if they're actually more like sponges, with all these other powerful forces flowing in and out, shaping their every single move? Well, the biggest challenge to this old model didn't come from some high-level government report. Now, it came from a deep, deep dive into dusty corporate archives that nobody had seen for decades. Back in 2000, a PhD thesis by a scholar named Kanwar Ranbir Singh did something pretty revolutionary. Singh got access to the internal records of oil giants like Shell and the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, which we now know as BP. And by digging through their private memos and minutes, a totally different story of global power started to emerge. And here's the absolute core of what he found. The so-called national interest wasn't some pure idea that was cooked up inside government buildings. It was actually forged in this constant push and pull between what governments wanted and what corporations wanted. National power, it turns out, isn't just a state-run enterprise.
So, this completely flips the script. We're moving away from that billiard ball idea to something Singh calls co-constitution, and it's a game changer. The idea is that the world isn't just states and firms acting separately. They're caught in this complex web where they literally create each other's realities. This thesis basically dismantles that old model with three killer arguments. First, how firms and states built their interests together during World War II. Second, how corporate competition basically kickstarted a Cold War crisis. And third, how the whole idea of national interest was constructed from the ground up in the 1951 Iran crisis. Let's look at the evidence.
Okay, let's start with that first point. What happened during World War II? Now, you'd think a massive global war would kind of put a pause on corporate deal-making, right? Well, the archives show the exact opposite happened.
So the big question is, who was really calling the shots on oil policy during the biggest conflict in human history? Was it the generals and the politicians? Or was there another, less visible hand on the wheel?
The myth is that the war just blew up all the old corporate cartels. But the reality? The cartel didn't disappear. It just went undercover. The very same oil executives who ran the show before the war were put in charge of official allied committees to manage oil supplies. Think about that. They were given government authority to not only help the war effort, but also to protect their own market share and plan for the post-war world. They were literally in a position to define what the national interest of Britain and America was. And, surprise, it looked a lot like their own corporate interest. And this web of influence wasn't just a wartime thing. Singh's research also shows how it could accidentally light a fire under the whole global system, sparking one of the first major crises of the Cold War. We usually think of the Cold War kicking off with these big, dramatic standoffs between Washington and Moscow. But what if one of its earliest flashpoints wasn't started by a president or a premier, but by a bunch of executives worried about their competition? Just follow the dominoes here. It all starts in 1944. Shell, a British company, gets nervous about American competition, so it starts sniffing around for new oil deals in northern Iran. To balance things out, Iran invites American companies to make bids, too. All of a sudden, the Soviets look down at their southern border and see a wall of Western oil companies setting up shop. They panic, make their own bid for oil, and start stirring up trouble with local separatists. And just like that, what began as a corporate scramble for profit explodes into a full-blown international crisis. But the most jaw-dropping example of this state-firm web in action, and this is our third key point, is how the very idea of a nation's interest was built and then destroyed during the Iran crisis a few years later. So in 1951, Iran's Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh does something incredibly bold. He stands up and says Iran's oil belongs to the people of Iran, and he nationalizes the gigantic Anglo-Iranian Oil Company. Now, from his perspective, this was about national sovereignty. But from the oil company's point of view, this was a declaration of war on their entire system.
And their response? Wow, the thesis shows they didn't just write angry letters. They acted as what Singh calls a great power condominium. Basically, they banded together and acted like their own country, like a coalition of superpowers. Step 1, form a united front. Step 2, organize a global embargo, making it impossible for Iran to sell a single drop of its own oil. Step 3, crank up production everywhere else so the world wouldn't even notice. The results? They completely bankrupted the Iranian state, which created the chaos and discontent that the CIA and MI6 needed to swoop in and orchestrate the 1953 coup. And this pressure wasn't just about money. The relentless campaign from the companies and their government allies had a psychological effect too. Singh argues it led to Mossadegh's psychological closure. He got to a point where he saw the oil company's hand behind every single diplomatic offer, making him totally unwilling to compromise. He saw the state and the company as one and the same. And, well, their actions pretty much proved him right. So after digging through all these declassified archives, after seeing all this evidence, what does it all mean for how we should see the world today? Well, for one thing, it's crystal clear. That simple, neat model of states as solid billiard balls, it just gets completely shattered by the messy reality of history. And in its place, we have this much more real, much more accurate picture of co-constitution. It shows us that agents, like countries and companies, and the structures they operate in, like global markets, they aren't separate things. They're locked in a constant dance, always shaping and reshaping each other. A company's hunt for profit can trigger a Cold War crisis. A government's foreign policy can open up a billion-dollar opportunity for that company. They're two sides of the very same coin. Which brings us to the biggest takeaway of all. The national interest isn't some fixed, noble idea just sitting there waiting to be discovered. It's constructed. It's built. It is profoundly shaped and sometimes even invented by this powerful dance between governments and non-state actors, like massive corporations. And that leaves us with a final, pretty heavy question. This research was about the 1940s and 50s. If this deep, tangled web of influence between states and firms was defining the national interests back then, you have to wonder, who's in the room helping construct it today?